Christianity spread into these places far before the missionary movements of the 18th and 19th century. And I hope that it helps to decenter our North American-centric or Western-centric way of thinking about Christianity, that in fact, it's been a global religion for a very long time.
The Great Wall of China serves as a powerful metaphor for just how difficult it's been to take Christianity to Asia. Century after century, walls of stone, indifference, and isolation have kept out Jesus' message of hope. China's Taiping Rebellion in 1850 was another wall. It was one of the most destructive civil wars in history. But as it raged, a committed young British missionary named Hudson Taylor was stepping off a boat in Shanghai. He had no idea what walls he would face, or what lay ahead for him and the missionaries who would follow. He had walked into the heart of a devastating revolution. It was another indication of just how difficult evangelism had been since the first missionaries made their way east. The remarkable story of those first Christians in Asia actually begins 2,000 years before Hudson Taylor's arrival. It started shortly after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. While most of the apostles ventured west from Jerusalem toward Europe, legend says the apostle Thomas went east. Don't miss the irony. The apostle who doubted Jesus the most was the one who traveled the greatest distance to proclaim his message.
India traded with the Roman Empire right since the beginning. And so there were traders, Jewish traders, who came in and set up communities in South India. So Thomas would have come in on one of those trading ships and established a congregation there.
And there is solid evidence for that. His body is buried in Chennai, and there's a whole memorial and mount, a whole church, in fact, dedicated to St. Thomas.
The tradition was known as Martoma, St. Thomas. Martoma Christians believe that that was the origin of their religious traditions. So we are talking about 3rd century or 4th century. That's the kind of earliest tradition of Indian Christianity.
It wasn't until the 4th century where we really saw the church emerge both amongst the Coromandel and Malabar coasts, which you could really call a big revival. It would be certainly considered the first revival in India. Would be around the 4th century, where they were baptizing 20,000 people a month amongst those two coastlines. And so the church was actually thriving in the south of India from the 4th century.
One of the great debates within the early church centered on the nature of God. In AD 428, Nestorius was the Archbishop of Constantinople until he was accused of heresy. But while condemned by the Council of Ephesus, he was welcomed by the Orthodox Church, so he headed east. His followers were called Nestorians, and they were passionate about evangelism. They traveled so far, so fast, that Nestorians were eventually called the Church of the East.
Those early centuries of Christianity were a time also of what they call the Christological debates, right? Who is Jesus? We come to believe fully God, fully man. But then others kind of put the accent more on God, others on man. Well, then is he half God, half man? All those controversies. So the Nestorians came down on one side of the debate. And so they were labeled later on by Western Christians as heretics.
They brought with their faith their Zoroastrian background, which was very dualistic. But they also had within their theology a mythology that there would be a savior figure who would be born miraculously and would bring about salvation for all of creation. They were very strong on creation. And they believed that this figure called a Shaoshant figure, when he was born, he would bring about salvation of the world. And so for Christians, they said, he's come. His name is Jesus, the Messiah. And so conversion rate was very rapid, and Christianity grew much more rapidly in Asia than it did in Europe. But it was a very strict sort of monastic form of Christianity, and they were literally wandering monks wandering across the rooftop of Asia.
up into the forbidding landscapes through these mountain passes into Central Asia, and then over the Silk Road into what is today China.
Asians, converting Asians, going from west to east. That was the first wave of Christianity going across.
Just as the system of Roman roads helped the early Christians travel throughout Europe, it was the Silk Road that opened the door to China and beyond.
The first documented information that we have about the church going into China was this Nestorian stele, which is a monolith near the city of Xi'an from 781 AD. But it traces the history back to about 635.
One of the themes in Asian Christianity is when there's a change in dynasty or rule or colonial power, Christianity changes. It often is just crushed by a new ruling group. So what happened in West Asia was the rise of Islam. And the early Muslim rulers actually looked favorably upon the Christians. Christians ended up being the people that would run the prisons. They'd be the accountants looking after finances. They would help connect with the Zoroastrian leaders, the Persian leaders. But very quickly, there were restrictions put on the Christians of how they could live in the empire. And as a result, the faith slowly became strangled by the Arab rulers in that area of the world. And so as a result, as Christianity had spread to China, it became isolated. And one of the things that we find out about Christianity is when it is isolated, when it is totally parochial, it slowly begins to atrophy. It was cut off both from the far west, Europe, but also it was cut off from the east. And as a result, the Christianity that had spread in China began to decline.
While that was collapsing, they were pushing up further into Mongolia. And so some of the tribes up there had converted to this Church of the East, some Nestorian churches, and all the way to the point where Genghis Khan's family intermarried with Christian tribes.
By the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest empire in the world. It stretched from Central Europe to the Sea of Japan, and from Siberia to India. And it was ruled by its greatest warrior, Genghis Khan.
What's called the Church of the East was the instrument or the channel that spread the gospel into much of the Asia today. And that as a result of their endeavor into the East, through the Silk Road, for trading and for religious purposes, many people came to what's today's Central Asia, including Mongolia. And they would usually go into a town, they would start a church, establish a congregation, and then they would share the gospel. With them, Christian culture came in, including like script. Mongolian script, which is the traditional vertical script, written from top to bottom, left to right, originates back to the Syriac script because Church of the East believers traveled to the east, and this script was adopted along the road by the Sogdians and Uyghurs and finally by Mongolians. Genghis Khan had a very tolerant policy in regards to religions. He tolerated all religions, so he allowed them to have their services, spread their faiths. This includes Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and all of them. Christianity wasn't any strange or a foreign religion. It was one of them. So he did encounter many Christians. The Great Mongol, which was the beginning of the Mongol Empire, consisting of 6 tribes, 4 of them were known to have Christians or known to be Christian tribes. Genghis Khan himself took wives for himself and for his sons from these Christian tribes, and also he had many Christians in his administrations who were educated, but also who had good skills, so he employed them.
It serves to show us that Christianity spread into these places far before the missionary movements of the 18th and 19th century. And I hope that it helps to decenter our North American-centric or Western-centric way of thinking about Christianity, that in fact, it's been a global religion for a very long time.